Well, hey, good to see you. I guess you decided you wanted to learn a little bit more about vampire lore, huh? Well, you've come to the right place. Despite my origins as a Hamid Galliard of Tribe Stargazer, aka a Geru, also known colloquially as werewolves, I spent quite a few years in my youth getting to know kindred, Cainites, vampires, as most people know them, largely because I thought I'd do my duty to fight the worm by hunting down and destroying vampires. And what I found as a good way to do that is to insinuate yourself in the court of one of these vampires. As soon as they know they have access to a werewolf's abilities, they will send you after all sorts of vampires and tell you all sorts of things that they might not otherwise should. And so though it's been a few years, have yourself a seat by a fire, and I guess we'll call this an introduction to Vampire the Masquerade. The game that started the world of darkness. So unless you've been living under a complete pop culture rock for the last 50 years, I assume you know the basics about what a vampire is, right? Can't go out in the sun, has to feed on human blood, cursed with a mortal life, and by and large a lot of that is true. There's some of the more older myths about garlic and holy symbols, and they can't be in a building they haven't been invited into and all that kind of stuff, is most of the time not true. However, vampires in the world of darkness divide themselves in a multitude of clans, bloodlines, and legacies. And each one has their own particular weaknesses, as well as some special supernatural abilities that they call disciplines. Which kind of explains the broad palette of legends of vampires that are out there, because, well, in different areas you had different kinds of vampires, and yet they're all really the same vampire. Mostly. This will probably take me a couple of episodes to get you through the entire spiel as to what's going on in Vampire the Masquerade. So I guess we're going to start off with the basics. We'll talk about the two major factions, the Camarilla, the Sabbat. We'll talk a little bit about the major independent clans. But for the most part, we're going to be running through most of your mainstream vampires and a few little side notes here and there as they relate to those mainstream vampire clans. But I guess before we get any further, we should probably go over what the basic rules of vampire society are. Their version of the litany.
The first tradition, the Masquerade. Thou shalt not reveal thy true nature to those not of the blood. Doing such shall renounce thy claims of blood. The second tradition, the domain. Thy domain is thine own concern. All others owe thee respect while in it. None may challenge thy word while in thy domain. The third tradition, the progeny. Thou shalt only sire another with the permission of thine elder. If thou createst another without thine elder's leave, both thou and thy progeny shall be slain. The fourth tradition, the accounting. Those thou create are thine own children. Until thy progeny shall be released, thou shalt command them in all things. Their sins are thine to endure. The fifth tradition, hospitality. Honor one another's domain. When thou comest to a foreign city, thou shalt present thyself to the one who ruleth there. Without the word of acceptance, thou art nothing. The sixth tradition, destruction. Thou art forbidden to destroy another of thy kind. The right of destruction belongeth only to thine elder. Only the eldest among thee shall call the blood hunt.
So from what I can gather from historical records from both groups, vampires and werewolves, compared to some of the other denizens of the world of darkness, have actually been pretty consistent over the centuries in terms of what we think we are and what we think we're doing. However, our two visions of reality and where we come from are massively different. Obviously, werewolves, we have our beliefs in the spirit world and our connections to the totem spirits and the Celestines, and that we're all helping Gaia defend the wild from the worm, which is being manipulated by the Weaver, and so on and so forth. Whereas vampires all believe that they're literally descended from the blood curse of Cain. That's Cain from the Bible, the first murderer, the guy who killed his brother Abel over farming equipment or something like that. He's a little bit bitter that Abel grew better tomatoes, and God liked him more for that, and so Abel had to die, and Cain was cursed to live forever immortal and cast out of his land, and, it doesn't jibe well with our version of how reality works and what history was, but Something I am starting to notice, though, from having interacted with the various factions of the World of Darkness, is that everyone has a very different idea of what's going on, which kind of makes me wonder if all of our lore is all just a bunch of lies and subjective supposition. Regardless, though, vampires believe they're descended from Cain's blood curse. They're not his literal children and grandchildren and so on. They're people that Cain turned into other vampires, and then those antediluvian vampires made Methuselah vampires, and then they made more vampires and more vampires. And each successive generation away from Cain, the blood gets a little weaker and weaker until you seem to bottom out somewhere around 13th or 14th generation, and they just lose the ability to properly pass the curse on any further than that. After they're turned into a vampire called the Embrace, the classic Anne Rice thing, they have all their blood taken out of them, and then they drink some vampire blood, and boom, they're a vampire. After the Embrace, their aging freezes unless their particular curse of their clan causes some sort of physical change. And then they're basically just stuck as they are for eternity until they're destroyed or they just give up. However, that legacy of Cain that they carry is that in order for them to be able to continue this nightly cursed existence for all eternity, they have to kill people and drink their blood. I mean, werewolves might certainly be guilty of certain crimes against humanity, but, we can still be werewolves without having to eat them. It's just they're so salty, you can't help it sometimes. They're like Lay's potato chips. You can't eat just one. But vampires act like human blood is some sort of combination of Red Bull and heroin. They derive an incredible amount of pleasure and ecstasy from the process of feeding, and thus, over the centuries, no matter how hard they might struggle against it, they inevitably slide further and further away from their original humanity and become something far more monstrous than even the worst Get of Fenris Arun. But we're not here to judge vampires overall as being bad or good. Yes, they all reek of worm taint, but just like us and, our foibles, there are individuals amongst them that buck trends and are redeemable people, so on and so on, yada, yada, yada. You get the drill. And what you're here for is to hear more about these two major vampire factions and the various clans that are your most dominant, basic bitch, entry-level types of vampires that you could potentially find yourself becoming in the World of Darkness. And so we'll start with the Camarilla. Camarilla is sort of a United Nations of vampire clans that emerged out of the chaos and repercussions of the Inquisition. A lot of vampires, some very old and important vampires were wiped out by the religious fervor of those times. And the survivors wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. And so the Camarilla was formed to sort of bring them all together under a common umbrella of authority and rule, so that they can monitor each other and help ensure that humanity doesn't notice their presence again. That's the whole point of the Masquerade, is to convince humankind that vampires aren't real, they're just stories out of fables and fictions, and those things that you see go bump in the night are just your imagination. Relying on the human's own dark side and tendency to abuse and hurt each other, as well as the social apathy of cities, to be able to conceal their presence. 7 of the clans are considered to be the backbone of the Camarilla, with some argument as to which one exactly came up with the idea in the first place. It's from the Camarilla that you get the entire structure of the vampire city political hierarchy. The prince, the primogen, elders, having to ask someone permission to be able to make a new vampire, all that stuff is all derived from Camarilla and Camarilla culture and policy. The Bruja are a clan of classic punk rockers, gangsters, wannabe revolutionaries, and social justice activists. I've long joked that the ultimate form of a Bruja would be a angry feminist woman who got embraced while she was still suffering from PMS and is cursed eternally to ongoing cramps and mood swings. But all kidding aside, stylistically, in many ways, the Bruja are kind of the face of modern vampires, combining an anarchist's punk rock aesthetic with the classic dark horror tropes that have been the signatures of vampires for time immemorial. Their whole gimmick is that they're angry and rude. They don't like the man. They really want to make sure that you know that they don't like the man and don't want anything to do with anything that the man wants you or them or anyone else to do. Because, it's the man. And I don't mean that in a gendered way. I mean like the iconic the man. There's plenty of dude Bruja, obviously. They've been with the Camarillas pretty much since the beginning, although a fair number of them are also in this kind of offshoot group called the Anarchs, who don't really have any organization beyond this kind of vague libertarian, everyone leave each other alone kind of philosophy. The anarchs occasionally pop up here and now, try to take hold of a city or spread their philosophy, but their lack of organization makes them victims easily to the Camarilla and the Sabbat, or they just find themselves being wiped out by mortal vampire hunters. But it's a dream of the Brujah to achieve true independence for the free people at the bottom of the pyramid, and so onward they struggle. However, I hear tale that there's a smaller group that calls themselves the True Brujah, who adhere to an older version of the clan's philosophies. Possibly like any good revolutionary body, the True Brujah were the ones that came up with all the ideas of the revolution, just to find themselves quickly being shut out by the more raucous and violent that they had to court in order to be able to achieve their revolution. And so the True Brujah are kind of a myth now, thousands of years later since all this happened. Something to do with ancient Carthage, I don't know, history's not really my bag. Which does, though, beg the question, are the modern Brujah a completely separate clan that are just calling themselves Brujah, or are they something more like a bloodline offshoot that has just swelled in numbers to outnumber the original version of the clan? I don't know. That's a bit above my pay grade here, and so other people are going to have to suss that one out. Now, if there is any clan of vampires that you would think would be able to get along with werewolves, that would be the Gangrel. They're into the wilderness, they like shape-shifting, hell, some of them even are able to take the form of wolves, which kind of makes them pseudo-werewolves, kind of. And yet, more often than not, when the two groups encounter each other out in the wilds, it just ends up becoming a bunch of territorial pissings, or the werewolves being hung up on the fact that the vampires innately just have this worm taint about them. They can't help it. They're creatures of death. Some are trying to be better people, but that doesn't really matter when you run into one in the dark woods at night and you don't really have a chance or opportunity to get to know their entire backstory. And they, the same of you. Vampires have a terrible impression of what werewolves are like, assuming that we're all as dumb as our animal kin. They view us as an entire species of Brujah, basically. And so these cultural misunderstandings make a roadblock between relations, between werewolves and gangrel vampires. But of all the Camarilla vampires in particular, if they're the most likely you are to find one that's not living in the dense urban heart of the cities. They are also among those more likely to try to feed off the blood of animals instead of humans, because of their isolation from places of civilization. Oh yeah, and there's the Malkavians. There should be a lot of potential in Malkavians, since they're cursed with madness. You can have some really interesting people crop up out of that, based on like how their madness intersects with their vampiric curse and existence, and how they have to thread that needle of delusion and this harsh, terrible reality that's already detached from what normal is to most people. But instead, most of them are just zany and annoying, like they're cartoon characters, and as much as vampires might view all werewolves as being a species of Brujah, the Malkavians are like a clan of vampires that distill all the worst traits of werewolf ragabash and then cranks it up to 11. Very disappointing overall, in spite of having a strong clan concept. I wish more Malkavian elders would put a bit more thought and nuance into the sorts of people they embrace. There's no nice way to say this, but the Nosferatu are like hideously ugly. Like, if there was some way you could track all of our various attributes and some sort of system of points, Nosferatu would have like an appearance of 0 or something. There's just no way for them to be able to pass as a normal human being. Think of the ugliest person you've ever personally laid eyes on, and then multiply that by 10, at the bare minimum, and you get a Nosferatu. The Nosferatu you see in movies doesn't do them justice, because, well, they're still Hollywood, and even ugly people have to be pretty in Hollywood. I feel sorry for them. They seem to mostly hang out in sewers and underground places. They live off rats and live like rats. And like rats, there might be more of them around than you would realize, because they practice arts of invisibility. And who could blame them? And then, oh my god, the fucking Toreador. These guys have walked straight out of an Anne Rice novel. All they care about is pleasure and sensation. They'll spend hours looking at a carpet. I don't know why people like them. But there's a lot of things about what humans like in terms of pop culture celebrity I'll never get anyway, so I guess maybe that factors into that. People just seem to think they're cool. but I personally kind of find them to be a bunch of empty vessels, who are way too easily distracted by pretty things, and hard to keep their focus on the important stuff. The Tremere are vampire wizards. For real, the first of them were wizards from the Great Dark Ages who turned themselves into vampires on purpose, and then wiped out an entire other clan in order to be able to become a clan themselves. They claim, alongside the Ventrue, to be the ones that came up with the idea of the Camarilla, and they certainly have their influence, although they are some of the hardest to get to know and talk to. They're very closed circle. They're loyal to their clan to a fault, and centuries of research into how to use their vampire blood to fuel their old magic spells makes them one of the most dangerous clans of vampires you could face if they have time to properly prepare for you. The vampire clan they wiped out to gain their own clan status were called the Salubri. Stories about these guys are kind of mixed. Some people even claim there's a few still out there, but the Tremere actively hunted them down centuries ago, so if there are any out there, they're deep in hiding, and there's maybe a handful on the entire planet. But to hear some people talk about it, they're great saints and healers, and to hear others talk about them, they were devil worshippers who like to feed on the blood of their own kind. I don't really have a dog in this fight, so I don't really know what to say about them beyond be on your guard, but be open to them being cooler than some of the other vampires might be. We just don't know. The Tremere also crafted a strange bloodline of gargoyles, supposedly by experimenting on vampires from 3 different clans, Nosferatu, Gangrel, and Tzimisce. They have stony skin, wings, monstrous visages. I mean, they look like the gargoyles they are named after, but they are basically just slaves and servants to the Tremere's will, although you hear stories about some going renegade every once in a while. I'm not sure if I buy it, though. Vampires are able to create a blood bond with each other by drinking each other's blood that can make it almost impossible for one to escape subservience to another if they find themselves in such a condition. And since the Tremere try to blood bind their members to the clan as a whole instead of individual Tremere, it's just hard to see what could have happened that could have broken a gargoyle from that sort of mindset. And last but not least are the Ventrue. These to me are the archetypical vampires. They're powerful, they understand power politics, they've been embedded in the machinations of government for centuries, if not thousands of years, pulling on the strings of leaders, kings, elected officials from the shadows behind the throne. And their main vampire weakness is that they're picky about who they like to feed on. I mean, yeah, if you would describe the vampires from Anne Rice's books like Louis and Lestat as being members of the TOREADOR clan, then I would describe the Ventrue as being the vampires from True Blood. Their weakness isn't terribly weak unless they've just decided to choose something very rare and hard to find as being the one kind of person they want to feed on. Like the Tremere, the Ventrue also claim to have come up with the idea for the Camarilla. And I would suspect the truth is that they both did it independently, and so they're both right and they're both wrong. Getting either of them to admit such a thing, though, is, well, yeah, not going to happen. At least not anytime soon without something terribly profound occurring on the level of their fabled Gehenna. So I guess that brings us to the Sabbat. The Sabbat are full of many contradictions. They present themselves as being an alternative to the Camarilla, but they're also a quasi-religion that presents an alternate paths for vampires to follow. They claim to reject the Masquerade and wish to flaunt their monstrousness and rule over mankind openly, making them literally the reason why vampires have the bad reputation they have, as they are the vampires most likely to attract all the wrong kinds of attention, especially from human hunter organizations, such as the Society of Leopold. Because of their religious nature, vampires of any clan can be found within the Sabbat. Such vampires that reject their normal clan lifestyle are called anti-tribu. However, there are 2 clans that have devoted themselves entirely to the Sabbat. The first of these are the LASOMBRA. Oddly, the Ventrue and LASOMBRA have a relationship that's very similar to the Silverfangs and the Shadow Lords amongst the Geru. Except in this case, the LASOMBRA have decided it is better to rule in hell, while the Shadow Lords will bow their heads to Silverfang authority when pressed. Like the Ventrue, they have an affinity for politics and games of power, ruling from the shadows quite literally, as their magic disciplines allow them to bend and warp darkness around them. The LASOMBRA are considered the de facto leaders of the Sabbat sect. And then there are the Tzimisce, or the Tzimisce. or the Shumase. I've heard them pronounced a couple different ways. I was originally introduced to them as Tzimisce, and so I'm just going to default to Tzimisce. The Carpathian vampires. The reason why you've heard the name Dracula. These ancient rivals of the Tremere practice their own forms of elemental sorcery and can shape flesh to create monsters of themselves and others. They are cold, cunning, and calculating, in a way resembling the harsh mountainous environments of Eastern Europe from which they hail. Like most other vampire clans, they are now scattered across the world to varying degrees, and they continue to harbor a deep enmity towards the Tremere. Through the Tzimisce art of vicissitude, they have also created a unique bloodline called the Blood Brothers. They are seldom seen by outsiders, but they seem to be collections of either ghouls or young vampires who've been shaped and remolded until they all form some sort of interlinked gestalt. One would assume that they exist to serve some sort of combat or defense role, but they are so rarely seen outside of Sabbat circles that it's really hard to tell exactly what the Tzimisce had in mind when they made them. I could possibly talk about the Anarchs a bit more, but they're kind of an anti-faction faction, so do they really qualify as a faction? Every once in a while they try to organize, take control of a whole city, but they're not very good at it. They fall apart all the time. Virtually any clan of vampire can be found within the ranks of the Anarchs. It's more about a personal philosophy of life that certain vampires hold in common than it is any particular rule of law or a common religion like you see with the Sabbat. Like the Sabbat, though, they only hold control over a tiny minority of the total cities of the world, which they seldom hold for very long. However, there are several independent clans that are as powerful as any of the clans of the Sabbat or the Camarilla, each pursuing their own strange and separate agendas. The Assamites are often billed as the Middle Eastern clan, although they are hardly the only clan of Middle Eastern origin or that still inhabits the Middle East. They are vampire assassins who used to practice the art of diablerie, the act of one vampire feeding on the blood of an older vampire to take their strength and power from them. But at some point a curse is placed upon them by the Tremere, which prevents them from taking part in their ancient sacrament. The followers of Set are the ancient enemies of the Silent Striders, and likewise hail from Egypt. They control widespread cults of serpent worshippers and Egyptian wannabes, can be every bit as clever as a Ventrue, or as deadly as an Assamite. The Silent Striders can no doubt tell you more of them. All I can say is that they are some of the most wormish of all the vampires. What with their association with serpents and all that, they are said to be even more fearful of the sun than most vampires, as it burns them hotter and faster than any of the other kindred. No doubt some curse put upon them by Ra in time immemorial. Lest I forget, there are also the children of Osiris. Like the Silent Striders, they are also ancient enemies of the Setites. Whether they are a proper vampire clan or another quasi-vampire religion, I am uncertain. And as to their current state of affairs, I cannot say. Since the reset to our world 20 years ago, I have not encountered one. But before then, the Amenti mummy I had met claimed that the children of Osiris's sire had risen and had gifted them with mortality, turning them into a cult of loyal followers who helped the Amenti mummies in their quest to battle the worm in the form of Set and his followers. In terms of mortal influence, the Giovanni are one of the most powerful clans on all of the earth. Theirs being the criminal underbelly that feeds society's vices. Run very much like something out of the Godfather movies. It is possibly for everyone else's benefit that the Giovanni take no interest in the greater politics between vampire clans, as they are every bit as ruthless and cruel as the institutions they control. They have some similarity to the Tremere, as the original Giovanni were members of a clan called the Cappadocians. The Cappadocians were considered one of the more kinder and gentler, wiser clans of their day. But the original Giovanni conspired to have more members of his mortal family embraced, and then through acts of diablerie, they replaced all the original Cappadocians. None have been seen in many a century. And yet once they were fairly widespread and considered to stand amongst the high clans along with the likes of the Ventrue and the Tzimisce and the True Bruja, as well as the LASOMBRA. Also like the Tremere, the Giovanni do practice their own forms of magic, namely necromancy, an art they developed based on the skills of their Cappadocian forebears. And then there's the Ravnos, Are we allowed to call them gypsy vampires anymore? Traveler vampires? Pikeys. Wanderers. They originally hail from India. And in fact, one of those apocalyptic events that only I seem to remember, but everyone else seems to have forgotten in the last 20 years, was when the founder of the Ravnos clan awoke in the middle of Bangladesh and had to be destroyed with weapons unleashed by the technocracy. Kind of an odd thing for everyone to have just kind of blanked out on, and yet everyone just kind of looks around weird if I mention it. But anyway, the Ravnos are cool. They have some traits in common with the Gangrel in terms of their wandering, carefree attitude, seldom staying in one place for long, whereas the Gangrel are a little bit more territorial. The Ravnos are also gifted illusionists, making use of a discipline they call chemistry to craft their illusionary effects. I would also mention the Bali. Now, some modern vampires consider them a bloodline as opposed to a clan, but there's been times in history where the Bali have stood as a clan and had quite a large amount of numbers. Just because there's not a lot of them right now doesn't mean they're any less of a clan than any remnant salubri might be. And in fact, vampires are weirdly hung up on all those sorts of details as to who gets labeled as what. But I guess werewolves do too in our own ways, so perhaps I shouldn't be casting any stones. Regardless, the Bali are pretty fucked up, man. They're devil-worshipping vampires, and/or devil-enslaving vampires, depending on who you ask, who are considered the baddest of the bad. You'd think them a natural fit for the Sabbat, but even the Sabbat doesn't want those cats hanging around. As I said, the Sabbat is kind of a religion, and the Bali are more about anti-religion, even if both employ rather bloody and murderous methods that would seem similar on the surface. The Bali are exceptionally dangerous. All jokes about them inventing the blues and rock and roll aside, these guys are not a joke. They're not to be trifled with. Even other vampires will band together and wipe them out if they discover their presence. And like the Sabbat, their atrocities are in part what drew the human inquisition upon the vampires in the first place. Which is why so many people think holy symbols have an effect on vampires as a whole. The vast majority of vampires are not casually affected by holy symbols unless they are wielded by someone with true faith. The Bali, on the other hand, cannot abide the sight of symbols of God. It will cause them great discomfort until they leave the presence of such symbols. Vampires wield an incredible amount of influence over the human world, possibly even more so after the Masquerade began than it was in the days before the Inquisition. Many will attract cults of personality about them in order to be able to have a pool of people that they can feed on without leaving a trail of bodies behind, or having people spreading stories about being attacked in the night by a creature with fangs. Their blood can also be given to a mortal human to create a ghoul, a person whose aging is frozen as long as they maintain some amount of vampire blood in their system, and can learn to use that blood to fuel some of the powers that their vampire masters can teach them. Ghouls are their greatest daytime servants, and some vampires go through a period of being a ghoul before they're embraced, so they can learn more about vampire society and prove their worthiness to the elders, before their sire gains permission to turn them. Many vampires also possess a magical ability to dominate the minds of the mortals around them, with very little effort. These networks of daytime servants not only provide vampires with political influence in human institutions, but also protects them from risk of discovery, helping them run their businesses and manage their assets, so everything seems above board in terms of paperwork. However, the unique nature of vampires and the limitations they have prevent from directly taking the throne over human governments, corporations, and religious institutions. All they can do is strategize and manipulate the powerful and the greedy. Well, I suppose that's enough for now. Next time we'll talk a bit more about ghouls and what they can do, as well as some of the other bloodlines that are out there, and some lost clans and other legends. And beyond that, I'll have to rely on my recent experiences with the Emerald Courts of the East to tell you what I know about the vampires of Asia. So until then, be sure to hit like and subscribe. Check out the link in the description box below to support the channel, and thanks for watching.
Enter a world of magic and the paranormal with Ghosts of the Shadow Zone. 2 complete tabletop games in 1. Featuring source material such as The Young and the Restless Dead, and Secrets of the Lesbian Illuminati, as seen in the classic horror tabletop collection. Available now at Amazon.com and DriveThruRPG.